I would like to welcome everyone today, and especially Professor Ali Mian and Professor Bruce Lawrence, who are going to be speaking today. Ali's talk today will be Surviving Genres, Rethinking the Islamic Discursive Tradition in Colonial India. Bruce Lawrence will be the respondent and interlocutor for the talk. Bruce is the Nancy and Jeffrey Marcus Humanities Professor of Religion at Duke University. He is author of a number of books: Who is Allah, Shattering the Myth, The Quran in English, a biography, Defenders of God. He's also recently published, or the Bruce Lawrence Reader has recently been published, and Ali Mian, I know, worked on the was an editor of the volume. We're so happy to welcome Ali back to Duke today. This is part of a scholar activist series that we've been doing with former Duke students, undergraduate students and graduate students. And welcome to Ali, welcome to Bruce, and welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, Ellen, thank you for introducing me, and I'm pleased to introduce Ali Mian. And I should tell people who don't know Ali Mian that he is a master at words and at feelings and at rhetoric. And so he's going to really introduce us to a person whom some of you may have heard of, the major thinker of South Asian Islam, named Sheikh Ashraf Ali Thanwi. And he will talk a lot about Thanwi in what you're going to hear. But what is really remarkable about it is that he takes somebody who's known and people know what they think and what Thanwi is supposed to stand for, and he kind of turns it on its head and then turns it back upside down and then turns it front ways. And suddenly you see a 3 or 4 dimensional figure where you thought it was 2-dimensional. And so that beauty of a topic that's known, a person who is well known, and then reshaping it so that you see, if I can use his own language, the affective or performative side of somebody who's usually cited as a scholar of traditional juridical thought, but really has also engaged poetry in a wonderful way that Ali brings out in his own presentation. So I was privileged to get it yesterday. I said to Ali, I can't introduce this without reading it. And I just have to say, I read it all through once. I said, I can't believe it. I read it through twice, and I said, it's still unbelievable. So without telling you what it would be like if I read it a third time, I just simply let me introduce Professor Ali Mian, and to say that he is at the University of Florida in Gainesville, where he's an assistant professor of religion, but he's also a chair, a fellow in Islamic studies, the Izzat Hassan Sheikh Fellow in Islamic Studies at the University of Florida. So I'm very pleased that in the midst of his writing and his teaching, and he's also very active as a father of 2 young children, that he's able to take time and be with us. And I look forward to hearing you. Reading you is a pleasure, but hearing you is even better, Ali Mian. So without further ado, Ali Mian on Sheikh Ashraf Ali Thanwi and desire.
Thank you so much, Professor Lawrence, and also Professor McClarney, for hosting me. It seems like a homecoming because I spent 8 years at Duke University from 2007 to 2015. And so this is my second time back giving a talk at DISC. I'm really honored. So today, the paper I'd like to present is titled Surviving Genres, Rethinking the Islamic Discursive Tradition in Colonial India. And this is actually an excerpt from an article that I'm actually preparing right now. It's forthcoming in the next issue of the Journal of Urdu Studies that is published by Brill, the new journal by Brill. And there it'll be titled Surviving Desire, Reading Hafiz in Colonial India. So in this paper, I really want to problematize how we understand the so-called scholarly or discursive tradition of Muslim thought and practice in modern-day South Asia. And I will engage in this paper with Shahab Ahmed, but also with the scholarship on Muslim traditionalism in South Asia. Um, so in one of his love poems or ghazals, the Persian bard, the Persian poet Hafiz says, now that the rose holds in its palms a cup of pure wine, the nightingale praises it with 1,000 tongues. Hold fast to the book of lyrics and proceed to the desert. Is there time for the seminary and debating the revelation of the revealer, the Kashf Kashaf? That's a reference to Zamakhshari's Kashaf. And then Hafiz continues, yesterday the seminary's jurist was intoxicated and issued a legal opinion, fatwa. Quote, while wine is illicit, it is still better than stealing from the awqaf or the public funds. Drink thankfully. It is not your prerogative to decide what's good or bad. For whatever our cupbearer Saqi has poured is indeed his grace, his Altaf. So I will leave the 4 verses from Hafiz on the screen. These metaphor-laden lyrics situate the perceived tension between sensual desire and moral law in 2 spaces, the desert, the Sahara, and the seminary, the Madrasa. The scene is something like this. The rose, the beloved, offers to the nightingale, the lover, a cup of pure wine, love. The nightingale lover in turn sings the praises of the rose beloved and is then instructed to take its love poems and proceed to the desert instead of studying scriptural theology in a madrasa. The next couplet, or distich more properly, complicates a simple division between sensual desire and moral law. The seminary's jurist or mufti appreciates sensual love and therefore contests public norms by directing blame towards those sins, such as stealing from public funds, that are more immoral than drinking wine. Finally, the nightingale lover is instructed to shun judgment in matters of love and instead to thank the cupbearer, the beloved or Saki, for the gift of wine or love. Hafiz ingeniously draws on sensual desire to explore social tensions and normative contestations. He juxtaposes the desert and the madrasa as 2 competing spaces of ethical normativity. The desert, on the one hand, is a space of seclusion where lovers can engage in the demands of sensual desire. The madrasa, on the other hand, is a space of public engagement where jurists prescribe social norms. Yet the poet acknowledges that sometimes jurists too experience the intoxication of love and complicate moral norms, such as the illicitness of wine consumption. The passionate nomad's exploratory aesthetics and the moralist jurist's prescriptive ethics can and do contaminate each other. Hafiz's ghazals thus deftly underscore the traffic between aesthetics and ethics. In his sweeping survey of post-classical Islamic humanities, the late Shahab Ahmad speaks eloquently, albeit exaggeratedly, about Hafiz's citational influence from the Balkans to Bengal. The piercing ghazals of Hafiz embody the way of love, or mazhab-e-ishq, which encompassed a mode of being with God, of identifying, of experiencing and living with the values and meaning of divine truth. Ahmad further argues that the textual space of the ghazal, along with the physical space of the drinking assembly, elucidates an alternative normative order, a way of being ethical that exceeds the moral law that is preached by theologians, jurists, and preachers. as the prized poet laureate of the way of love, Hafiz exemplifies the capacity of literature to articulate and to imagine counter-normative ethics. The broader ambition of Ahmad's What is Islam is to denaturalize the privilege often assigned by both modern Muslims and Western Orientalists to theology and law as the definitive loci of normative Islam. Ahmad argues that while Muslims have used both prescriptive, legalistic, and explorative aesthetic discourses to embody ethical norms, modern Western scholarship lacks a conceptualization of Islam that is capacious enough to encompass Muslims' competing, often contradictory relationships with the event and experience of divine revelation. For Ahmad, ethics, akhlaq, and literature, adab, co-implicate each other. They mutually inform and constitute each other. Ethics, normative or otherwise, is bound up with literary aesthetics. The capacity of the ghazal to express practices of self and sociality that stem from representations of divine and earthly beauty speak to the intimate link between ethics and aesthetics. The ghazal in both form and content is especially instructive here, since it engenders the ambiguity and ambivalence needed to explore different relationships to the normative order. Ahmad's argument about a distinct ethics and aesthetics grounded in mazhab-e-ishq should be contextualized within the broader remapping of medieval, early modern, and even colonial era Persian sources on the part of scholars such as Niall Green, Richard Eaton, and Manakia. This remapping both elucidates non-Arab centric scenes of connectivity and exposes the limitations of nationalist historiographical paradigms. The use of alternative terms such as Persianate civilization, Persianate societies, and the Persianate world has importantly displaced the often reductive and distorting frames of religion and nation. Yet, in a different way, the Persianate has come to stand in for religion light culture, and as such, this frame contains its own epistemic exclusions. In a place and time like early modern and colonial India, the term Persianate does not name every single epistemic and cultural source of self and sociality. For example, in Fondu Seattle, colonial India, the Urdu poet and literary critic Altaf Hussain Hali, who lived from 1837 to 1914, theorized poetry within a capacious citational framework that consisted of Arabic, Persian, and English poetics and literary histories. The scholars who intervened in Urdu literary criticism from the vantage of Persian literary history, such as Shibli Nu'mani, who authored the 5-volume um, literary history of Persian poetry titled Shi'r al-Ajam, and Shibli lived from 1857 to 1914. So Shibli Nu'mani too straddled multiple civilizational frames of reference from Persian mystical poetry to Hanafi legalism. He has a very popular book in the context of Urdu South Asia on Abu Hanifa called Siratul Nu'man. So he straddled Persian mystical poetry to Hanafi legalism to Orientalism. The case of Shibli's contemporary, the Sufi theologian Ashraf Ali Thanvi, who lived from 1863 to 1943, is even more telling in this regard. So Ashraf Ali Thanvi is not only a Sufi, a jurist, a theologian, a mufassir, and a muhaddis, and so many other things, but he is also a shari or a commentator on both Rumi's Masnavi and Ma'navi, He has a commentary called Khalid Masnavi, which is in 24 volumes, but it's bounded in 12 volumes. And he also has a commentary on Hafiz called Irfan Hafiz. So the case of Shibli's contemporary, the Sufi theologian Ashraf Ali Thanvi, is even more telling in this regard. Since Ashraf Ali Thanvi reworked the ethical aesthetic paradigm of Mazhab-e-Ishq to elaborate the erotic aspects of ritual piety and law-bound morality. In other words, the Sufi theologian translated and domesticated Persian poetry to highlight the passionate dimensions of Sharia practices. Hafiz's sustained lyrical defense of sensual pleasure and sexual desire, however, was a major obstacle between Ashraf Ali and a Sharia-friendly, repurposed Persian lyrical tradition. And this is basically the problematic that I am looking at, that what hermeneutic moves does Ashraf Ali does he have to make in order to religionize or um, or to make Hafiz Sharia friendly? In Ashraf Ali's lifetime, Hafiz was slowly being transformed in late Qajat and early Pahlavi Iran from a polyvocal Persian poet to a nationalist Iranian prophet, a recasting of cultural memory that aimed to, quote, displace Islam with a religion of Persian poetry, end of quote. Contrary to this secularization of Hafiz, the Indo-Muslim theologian Ashraf Ali Thanvi embraces Hafiz's mystical theological legacy, but attempts to integrate the lyrics of the Persian bard into his own world by means of writing a commentary on the Divan, namely Irfan Hafiz, which can translate to the mystical insight of Hafiz. Ashraf Ali uses the ambiguity and ambivalence inherent in Hafiz's ghazals to elaborate a practical mystical theology. This is evident in the following commentarial note by him on the lyrics with which we started. So he says, these verses underscore the significance of rushing to an ideal Sufi master in order to quench your thirst for divine love. The Sufi master distributes the gift of God or the gift of God consciousness, and you can see the fruits of his efforts by observing the good actions of his disciples. His companionship can prepare you to undertake social exclusion, after which you can postpone your intense study of the exoteric sciences. So here we see an Ashraf Ali whose legacy does not really fit into how extant scholarship on the Deoband tradition, which is one of the masalik, one of the theological orientations of the Muslim discursive tradition in colonial India, um, how the scholarship portrays this tradition, these lines from Ashraf Ali, they don't really fit into that portrayal of his life world. So I argue that Ashraf Ali's mode of reading relies on translational equivalences that presuppose an analogical correspondence between sensual passion or metaphorical love, ishq majazi, and desire for the divine or real love, ishq hakiki. So how Ashraf Ali is able to domesticate Hafiz is by assuming that the analogy between ishq majazi and ishq hakiki holds, that it does not shatter and that it is a legible analogy. This mode of translation assumes a qualitative analogical equivalence between passion and piety. So he does not necessarily see that passion and piety are mutually contradictory. He sees them as one and the same. Analogy is here understood not as the production of identity at the expense of erasing difference, but as an illusion of identity that is haunted by difference. Ashraf Ali reinforces this understanding of analogy. He reinforces this understanding of analogy in his answers to the question, how is it possible for the world of multiplicity to both conceal and reveal the one? And this, how he answers this question, really brings him actually very close to Shahab Ahmad in one way, right? So Ashraf Ali says that it is possible for the world of multiplicity to both conceal and reveal unity in three ways. First, materiality conceals the real for worldly lovers, for the ashikin, but it reveals the real for the Gnostics or for those who know God, or the real, the arifin. Second, he says, the sensible world conceals God's essence, that, but reveals God's attributes or God's sifat. And finally, the immanent world conceals transcendental reality from the common folk, the awam, but reveals it to the elite folk, the khawas. These dyads sorry, I'll come back to this slide, but let me go back to this one actually. These dyads apparently partition eros, God, and society along an axis of appearance and reality. Yet the play of metaphor infuses these dyads. And here I'm going to borrow from Jacques Derrida. Yet the play of metaphor infuses these dyads with plasticity and ambivalence. The sensible object survives the passage from the physical to the metaphysical. And that is what I mean by analogy, that analogy does not construct identity at the expense of erasing difference. Rather, analogy facilitates plasticity or mobility, right? So something of the sensible survives in the transcendental. Something of the of, of, of the sensual and the physical, of the empirical, of the immanent survives in the transcendental. In other words, metaphors are prone to transgression, and each movement of idealization, quote Derrida, each movement of idealization ends up elevating, suppressing, and conserving the sensory exterior from which a metaphor draws its rhetorical and sometimes affective force. In this way, for Ashraf Ali, to reinforce these dyadic categories is actually an invitation to explore and sometimes to affirm the fluidity between the divine real and the world of multiplicity. So often people think that Derrida's critique of dyads and binarism means that we get rid of binaries altogether. But actually, I think Derrida is more subtle than this. And this is where I think deconstruction becomes really helpful as an analytical tool, because most of Islamic sources that students like me are engaged in reading, they are constantly affirming binaries and dyads. So if you have a critical analytical paradigm that wants to always get rid of the binaries, we are not really doing justice to our sources. So we need a critical analytical paradigm that respects the binaries, but then tries to show how they are mutually co-implicating each other. And I think that Derrida, he juxtaposes the validity of dyads and then shows how their separation and their partition breaks, and they're actually at once they are identical and different. So the point of deconstruction is not to affirm pure difference, and is not to reinforce identities, but it is to reinforce identity and difference at the same time. Ashraf Ali's Irfani Hafiz thus stages an eroticization of Sharia practices that in turn provides a strong affective grounding for the culture of embodied ethics based in the madrasas and Sufi lodges of colonial India. With the help of Persian poets such as Hafiz and Rumi, Ashraf Ali elaborates a theory of self and society that neither upholds a progress-driven social reform like people such as people like Altaf Hussein Hali, nor does Ashraf Ali call for revitalizing the Muslim self for the sake of political self-determination like Muhammad Iqbal. In other words, he does not advance the dominant Indo-Muslim responses to colonial modernity. The self that emerges in Ashraf Ali's practical mystical theology embraces both the erotic travails of the lover and the beloved's gift of grace. My argument intervenes in multiple disciplinary conversations. First, I question Ahmed's assessment that modern Islam has suffered a radical diminution, a radical decrease of in those forms of linguistic expression, namely metaphor and paradox, that are necessary to express ambiguity. The following analysis of Irfani Hafiz suggests that the way of love or mazhab-e-ishq and the ambiguous interplay between ethics and aesthetics survive in modernity. This is in part what I mean by my title, Surviving Desire. And today we have the title Surviving Genres, and here I'm really trying to show the survival of the ghazal form in colonial India. But the article from which I'm reading, which is forthcoming in the next issue of the Journal of Urdu Studies, that article is called Surviving Desire. And what I mean by surviving desire is how Hafiz's emphasis on the disposability of the world, but also the longing for the beloved, they survive even in traditionalist theology in colonial India. So I am really talking about how desire survives the onslaught of modernist reform and how the subject endures the tribulations of desire through the gift of grace. Second, so the second disciplinary conversation that I am intervening in, I complicate our understanding of Muslim traditionalism in modern South Asia. Ashraf Ali's mystical theological engagement with the Persian lyrical canon demonstrates that Islam as a discursive tradition is irreducible to both scripture and jurisprudence. So in the broader project, I'm really questioning how we have come to understand the discursive tradition. And really, I'm building on Talal Asad's foundational work here. And I acknowledge that Talal Asad himself has come to emphasize what he calls the sensible body and also the ensouled body um, in his more recent work. So, but at the same time, I think that we also need to add gender and desire in our discussion of the sensible body and the ensouled body. Um, so, so my point is that Islam as a discursive tradition is not reducible to scripture and jurisprudence. Rather, engagement with love poetry has often provided Muslims an aesthetic medium to propagate and practice their ethical concerns and projects. And my third scene of intervention is that I make a modest contribution to the scholarship on Urdu literature by attending to an approach to lyrical poetry that shuns both social reform and anti-colonial nationalist struggle. So I'm going to summarize the next 10 pages of my paper in the following two slides. In basically when I contextualize Ashraf Ali's approach to Hafiz, there are two other major figures who had something to say. There are actually many figures, but the two that I focus on, the first is Shibli Nu'mani and the second is Muhammad Iqbal. So Shibli Nu'mani's engagement with Hafiz is actually very sympathetic. And he wants to demonstrate that how Hafiz excelled in the ghazal genre. Hafiz, for him, embodied or practiced the ghazal genre in a more eloquent manner than any other pre-modern poet or any other actually poet of the Persian lyrical tradition. And in order to do that, he lists what you see on your screen. He lists 11 sources that make a ghazal excellent, right? He lists the 11 sources that give um, beauty to the ghazal form. And then he shows that while Hafiz might be defective in one or two of these sources, overall, Hafiz has really no peer when you look at all of these 11 sources of the excellence of a ghazal. So that is Shibli Nu'mani's reading of, um, of, of Hafiz in Shi'r al-Ajam. The, the other major reception of Hafiz that I actually engage with at quite at length in the paper, but here I will just summarize very briefly, is the work of Muhammad Iqbal. And you all already know this, that Iqbal, he was really fond of Rumi, and he restored the importance of Rumi, and he really displaced and he sidelined Hafiz. And these 5 verses from Iqbal's Asrar-e Khudi, the secrets of selfhood, they really capture his critique of Hafiz. I want to note here that these were included in the first edition of Iqbal's Asrar-e Khudi, the secrets of selfhood, but then many Sufi personages of colonial India, such as Khwaja Hassan Nizami of Delhi, they fiercely critiqued Iqbal and they said he has misunderstood Hafiz. And when the second edition of The Secrets of Selfhood was published, Iqbal had actually deleted these lines. But in his correspondence, we know that he did not change his opinion on Hafiz. So let's read these together. He says, "Beware of Hafiz, the wine drinker, for his cup's supply is the poison of death. He pawned his hair shirt to the cupbearer. Wine is the cure for the heat of his fervor. He is the cleric of the wine drinker's nation. He is the priest of the religion of the hapless. His harp's melody is the proof of decadence. His muse is the Gabriel of decadence. A rosebud snake endowed with pure poison proceeds by first lulling its prey to sleep." So Iqbal, what's really fascinating is that the scholarship on Iqbal has really demonstrated how Iqbal's um, formal practice of verse making is deeply influenced by Hafiz. But what Iqbal does is Iqbal takes the metaphorical eloquence of Hafiz and he turns it against Hafiz. And here, wine and the cupbearer and all of these, allusions to the culture of wine consumption are to be read allegorically, because what Iqbal is saying is that Hafiz, you have really poisoned the Muslim community with this mazhab-e-ishq, with this way of love. And this is an obstacle for political self-determination. We need something that embraces the will and not a self-negating mood to the world, right? So the disposability of the world that is so deeply ingrained in the poems of Hafiz troubles Iqbal, and he goes to Rumi instead. But Ashraf Ali Thanvi does not actually find those elements in Hafiz problematic. In fact, he embraces them because they fit into his mystical understanding of religion and Sharia itself, right? The disposability of the world and the intoxication, this passionate desire for the everlasting, they fit into his understanding of the Sharia. So his key hermeneutic strategy is that he translates, so now I'm talking about Ashraf Ali Thanvi, is that he translates sensual metaphors and themes into mystical realities and states of being. And here he has many pre-modern and modern theologians who have followed the same path. So he's not unique in this respect. You know, Alama Tabatabai, for example, had has also a two-volume work on the mystical reading of Hafiz's poetry. So now I want us to return to the poem with which I started, which started with, now that the rose holds in its palms a cup of pure wine, the nightingale praises it with 1,000 tongues. So Ashraf Ali Thanvi suggests that the rose here is a metaphor for the Sufi master, who is a dispenser and conduit of passionate glances of attention. Fuyuze ishqiya ka qasim or wasita. Note how Ashraf Ali Thanvi, how he translates the other metaphors used by Hafiz in the lyrics with which we started. So the nightingale becomes the Sufi disciple. The book of lyrics, it becomes the obligations of Eros. The desert becomes spiritual seclusion. The madrasa, the madrasa stands in for the exoteric sciences of the Quran, Hadith, and jurisprudence, and wine stands in for the actions forbidden by the jurists but found among Sufis nonetheless, due to being overpowered by trance-inducing feelings. So this is what I'm calling the plasticity of metaphors, and Ashraf Ali Thanvi actually embraces these metaphors and their plasticity. Translation strategies of this sort form the backbone of Ashraf Ali's Irfani Hafiz. Elsewhere, the colonial era Sufi theologian argues that central metaphors in Persian love poetry are didactic instruments to flesh out divine love. In his commentary on Hafiz's Diwan, however, Ashraf Ali takes for granted an analogical correspondence between the experiential dimensions of sensual and divine love. And if there's one point that I really want to underscore today, it is this thesis on my part that I am seeing, even in Deobandi sources, an affective equivalence between sensual desire and metaphysical desire. So what I'm trying to say is that desire cannot itself be partitioned. Whether you love a lovely face that is sensible, or whether you long for the divine, the eternal, desire itself cannot be partitioned. It can be distinguished in relation to the object and the style with which you love, but the affect of desire um, is actually the same. So I say that the maintenance of this analogy presupposes fluidity between the sensible and transcendental objects of desire. It also suggests that an identical experience of desire underlies sensual striving and religious rigor. And I guess a part of my political agenda is for Muslim traditionalists to also appreciate sensual love and sensible objects of desire, because you cannot really love the divine without the sensual object, without the empirical object. And if we can appreciate that, then I think we can really open up the politics of embracing multiple forms of desire and sexual lives, right? And I think that my project and my reading of the discursive tradition, it really wants traditionalists to see how their own tradition presupposes the significance of the sensible object of desire, which is the bedrock of metaphysical or desire or longing for the divine as well. So in the paper now, I'm going to actually skip many pages and take you to another illustration. This is basically the opening line of Hafiz's Divan, and it's a beautiful, it's a beautiful um, distich in which Hafiz says, "Come Saki," and this is in the first, the hemistiche of this distich is in Arabic. He says, "Come Saki, pass the drinking glass around. Eros seemed a simple game when I encountered it, but then came the difficulties." Um, And Ashraf Ali Thanvi, in his commentary on this, he explores the apparent meanings and latent implications of this couplet's key terms. The word Saki means both the one who serves wine and the eternal beloved, the Mahbub-e Haqiqi. Ka'as refers to the drinking glass, but also to erotic attraction, Jazbe Ishqi. Eros or Ishq for the commentator becomes the mystical path or suluk, which in turn includes affective and epistemological stations or maqamat. Ashraf Ali Thanvi has a deep understanding of metaphorical language and deploys it to his advantage. He then gives his reader an overview of the Sufi path based on his commentary on this single distich. He says, these words clarify the following truth, and this is going to get technical in terms of some Sufi terms, but please bear with me. These words clarify the following truth. Without attraction, jazb, the mystical path, suluk, in itself remains insufficient for attainment of the objective. So he's basically recognizing that without um, physical desire, there's no beginning of Sufism, of Sufi experience. It is also important to underscore that the terms the mystical path and attraction do not parallel mindfulness and oblivion. Rather, the mystical path consists of spiritual stations, maqamat. So it's really affective and it's not intellectual. And these maqamat correspond to the reformation of inner virtues by means of bodily rituals. This reformation enables one to cultivate the capacity to establish an intimate relationship with the divine. The seeker, however, has no control over acquiring this relationship on his own. This is what I mean by grace. He's saying that affect is not in your hands. You can't just say, oh, let me experience passion for this or that object. It happens spontaneously, and the experience of affect is that it displaces you, right? It really unmoors you and it unhinges you and it perplexes you. And that, really from secularist and from theological perspective, affect has to be recognized as something that the subject is incapable of inducing by herself or himself or themselves. It is entirely contingent on the grace of God. This intimate relationship comes about due to attraction or jazab, which in turn is contingent on the attention of the unseen faiz ghaibi and the gift of God inayat haq. Another name for this relationship is attainment of God, wusul ilallah. The point is that to tread the mystical path is voluntary, but to receive the gift of attraction is involuntary. So I'm going to actually go to directly to my conclusion now. So in this presentation, I have, and I just want my kind listeners to note that I have now skipped about 20 pages of examples. In this presentation, I have deployed Ashraf Ali Thanwi's Irfani Hafiz to intervene in several scholarly conversations. First, as my close reading of this text demonstrates, prescriptive and explorative modes of meaning making often reinforce each other, and modern traditionalist theologians and jurists too have participated in the way of love. This reading complicates Shahab Ahmed's claim that modern Islam has witnessed the radical diminution of ambiguity. Um, Second, I want to say that my engagement with Irfani Hafiz has highlighted an aspect of Deobandi traditionalism, namely its relationship with Persian love poetry that has been excluded from the existing scholarship. To attend to this foreclosed aspect of modern Islam, in turn deepens our understanding of the affective life of the Islamic discursive tradition. Finally, for scholarship on Urdu literature, specifically its commentarial and critical relationship with the Persian literary tradition, the case of Ashraf Ali Thanwi highlights an alternative mode of engagement that does not easily fit into the modernist reformist project of poets and critics such as Hali and Iqbal. Ashraf Ali does not instrumentalize poetry for the sake of social reform or anti-colonial nationalist struggle. It is important that such marginalized approaches be included in scholarly surveys of the Urdu literary tradition in colonial India and the persistence of Persian literature and Persianate culture in modern South Asia. So in a way, I am supporting the broader ambition of the Persianate turn and also Shahab Ahmad's thesis, but I'm just saying that it extends to a lot more sources than are included in the burgeoning work on the Persianate turn. Finally, throughout, I have alluded to the interplay between ethics and aesthetics, and I find it apropos to conclude by returning to this broader frame. And here I will talk about the language of prayer, rich. So the language of prayer, ritual or otherwise, is intimately bound up with the ethics of listening for the beloved and waiting for the beloved to respond. Let us examine one final commentarial note on Ashraf Ali's part. And the couplet that I have in mind, it's a beautiful couplet from Hafiz in which um, the, the lyrical subject says, "My soul has arrived at my lips and longs to behold you. Shall it turn back? So shall my soul turn back or depart? What is your command?" Ashraf Ali paraphrases, "O my beloved, this lover of yours intends to behold your face. My soul has now arrived at my lips, where it awaits your command. What shall I do? Do you want me to stay here or do you want me to come there? I know I will suffer the pain of a few more days in this world if I return. Yet I will be relieved if I depart my body. At any rate, I am pleased with whatever action brings you pleasure." So what I want us to note is the interplay of annihilation or fana and baqa or subsistence in this, but also the interplay of sensual desire and beholding the face of the beloved. And Ashraf Ali Thanwi, he also, when is commenting on this, he's not speaking as a theologian per se, but he assumes the voice of the lover, right? So the commentary genre enables him to express sensual love for the sublime object. And that is something that is not emphasized in the scholarship on Muslim traditionalism in colonial South Asia, that the experience of belonging to tradition, it is really about affective investment in the disposability of the world and the sublime object. Um, so the erotic impulses of Hafiz's ghazals survive in Ashraf Ali's practical mystical theology because of his assumption of a qualitative analogical correspondence between the sensual and sublime objects of desire. It is significant that he uses Persian poetry quite extensively in his body of work to elaborate the practical demands and affective trials of an erotic relationship with the divine as beloved. By approaching poetry as mystical literature, then, Ashraf Ali embraces an ethics of self-annihilation and a poetics of grace. However, self-annihilation does not mean the extinction of the self. So he doesn't actually mean death here. What he means is that should I keep on being intoxicated in you, O God, or should I actually go back and serve humanity? And where earlier Sufis had said that it is better for the person who has experienced fana, annihilation, it is better for him or her to return to society and serve humanity. Ashraf Ali says that we actually don't have control over what we'll do, because the capacity to persist in fana, in annihilation, and the capacity to return to society, baqa, is also a gift of grace. So Ashraf Ali, he differs from his modernist contemporaries such as Iqbal by insisting on the gift of grace. Recall Ashraf Ali's words discussed above when he says, the seeker has no control over acquiring this relationship with the divine on his own. It is entirely contingent on the grace of God. While Iqbal encourages Muslims to seize the day to activate the transcendental potential of their immanence, Ashraf Ali retains the gulf between God and the beloved and the human being or lover. He thus retains what Martin Buber called the primal distance between the divine and the human self. This distance prevents the other from being reified into an object or an it. The retention of this gap in turn yields a view of human desire that originates from God and therefore tests the human being or the lover, since the total possession of the sublime object remains a structural impossibility. Surviving desire does not mean overcoming the tantalizing enticement of the other. Rather, by using this phrase, I have in mind two distinct but overlapping meanings. First, it implies the persistence of the self or the ego in the face of eros due to the gift of grace. The bouts of passion can often overpower the senses, but they are also full of pleasure if the beloved is graceful enough to reciprocate a glance of affection. Second, it names a desire that survives amidst the sublimating coups of social reform and the politics of self-governance. The sensual object endures as or in love for the divine, and it continuously disrupts the illusions of progress and sovereignty. It is in these two ways that Hafiz's lyrical exposition of desire survives in Ashraf Ali's commentarial notes on the Divan. Thank you so much for your patience.
Am I live now?
Yes, you are.
Well, thank you, Ali Mian, for that wonderful summary of a very much longer article with more examples. As you said, you left out 20 pages, and I would have liked to have heard you talk for 2 hours and skip all the questions and answers, but we have some questions from people, and I'm going to get to them in a moment, but I have one prior question. I know you know the name Alexander Kanish, and he's done a book on Sufism, where in effect, he makes the argument that there's this huge difference between Sufism, Tasawwuf, and Irfan, or reflection in a mystical vein. And he says the primary difference, of course, is that Sufism depends on Hanukkah and abodes and the transmission from master to disciple. And one of the things that I want to ask you about, and this goes back to Shahab Ahmed, but also goes back to Hodgson, whom you know makes the same comment, that in the latter part of modernity, what you have is a decline of Persian or Persianate spirit, which is both secular and spiritual, which transcends, in fact, that dichotomy of secular and spiritual. But the only way in which it gets communicated in Sufism is through the lodges and through the turuq or orders. And those have been reduced in size and number and, of course, in actual physical space in the modern subcontinent, since, let's say, 1857 to the present. So in the face of the reduction of a physical presence, where this ambiguity that Ashraf Ali Tanwi teases out so beautifully and that you have reclaimed in your essay, how is it possible to communicate with a broader audience the meaning of what he's saying?
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. And yes, I also want to note that in addition to Professor Knish making that distinction, Ata Anzali also, I think, has very insightful things to say about the category mysticism or irfan. And I think the version I sent you, Bruce, I do engage very briefly with Anzali as well.
Right.
But the question you are asking is that I think demographically and also empirically, Sufi spaces have decreased in modern South Asia. And I think that in colonial India, of course, they were being decreased, but Ashraf Ali had his Sufi lodge and he had a khanqa, and there were a number of Sufi lodges and khanqas that were operative. And even in post-colonial South Asia, there are mixed spaces, right? Sometimes a mosque turns into a temporary space where instead of a full-fledged lodge, a Sufi theologian who is either Barelvi or Deobandi will counsel disciples, but then they'll get up and pray, and then other people will have a different function in the mosque. There are very few Deobandi khanqas left in both India and Pakistan, but they are not extinct. So in Karachi, there is actually the Khanqa Imdadiya Ashrafiya, which Ashraf Ali's disciples and their disciples still manage. But I think the point here is that our understanding and the scholarship on this discursive tradition should attend to the survival of the Persian mystical tradition in a truncated or in a displaced form. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize, that the tradition and the heritage is going to change, and the khanqas might not be there, but in the reformed and the displaced versions of those forms of life, something will survive. And I think it will be a different project to see what survives today. I was trying to see what survived in colonial modernity. And I think that the emphasis on sensuality and the disposability of the world, that survived in Ashraf Ali. And that is why we see that he is not really very thrilled about anti-colonial nationalist politics on the one hand, and he is a social reformer, but he's not fully engaged in the type of progress-driven social reform that other thinkers in colonial India are. So what survives is the emphasis on, I think, intoxication. The object of intoxication for him is, of course, the divine, but as I'm trying to argue, that intoxication itself is a singular experience which can be partitioned only with reference to the object, but as affect, it cannot be partitioned.
No, that's beautifully said. And I have questions of my own, but I'm going to defer to the Sheikha among us, Marcia Hermanson, who has raised a question that I think will also engage you. So Marcia wrote that you started with the spaces from the poem of Hafiz, the spaces of the desert and the madrasa. And then she asked, how about the spaces of the kharabat and the Hanukkah?
Yes, so I noted if, sorry, go ahead. I don't know if that was the question or more.
Yeah, I don't, Deb, can you read that question as well? But her question is,
let me
actually, talking about contrast of spaces, is some of the spaces of the Sahra and Madrasa, the desert of the Madrasa, but also the Kharabat and the Hanukkah. And she just wonders, in terms of analogies or metaphors or symbolism, does this come up in Tanabi's commentary on Hafiz, the Kharabat and the Hanukkah?
Yes, they do. And I actually note that in a footnote that the Sahara or the desert and the Madrasa are just two of the many, I think, topological tropes, right? Topological tropes that exist in the Divan, and in different ways, Hafiz himself is challenging dominant normative orders through those space, through what he in what he says about those spaces and their differences. So they do come up, and he does see the kharabat, that the tavern, as well as the khanka as basically two spaces. But I would have to think about more about how that plays out in the South Asian imaginary, because I think what Professor Hermanson is also asking is, what does Tanmi or Ashraf Ali, he himself referred to, in his writings, he referred to himself as Ashraf Ali. So I like to call him by how he referred to himself. So Ashraf Ali actually, it would be a different question to see if, what does he say about the persistence of the wine taverns in Islamic South Asia? And I think here, this is where he does approach these questions as a jurist, because you see, his project is very much that of intoxicating the Sharia, right? He wants the Sharia and Sharia practices basically to become fully eroticized, so that they can attend to the subject's affective needs in a more adequate manner. And so he's not just for the intellectualization of the Sharia practices. He wants to eroticize, he wants to make them affective and passionate, so that they can fully attend to the needs of at least his disciples.
Well, I can see someone summarizing your talk by saying, South Asian professor in Florida proposes eroticizing Sharia practices through Ali Tanabi. But I won't give you that title. I'll let somebody else give it. And Marcia, I hope that answered your questions. I have so many other questions that have been raised, Ali Mia. And there's someone named Aruj Alam, who I don't know, but has raised two questions, either one of which could occupy you for the next half hour. But let me try the second of his two questions, which I think is the easier of the two. He asked, how can scholars deploy the concept of ambivalence, which seems to be emerging in current scholarship? And he mentions, I know this book you know also, Thomas Bauer's A Culture of Ambiguity. How can current scholarship in Islam provide something like what you're talking about, ambivalence, ambiguity, as a corrective to some of the problematic assumptions that still operate in the field of Islamic studies?
Mm-hmm. Can you please point me to where that question is written out?
Okay, it's Aruj Alam. He wrote it at
Yes.
Thank you,
6:53.
Professor Lawrence. I asked the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. So you can.
Hello, Aruj. How are you?
Hello, Dr. Mian. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm learning so
I hope
much.
you don't mind if I restated your second question first.
That's perfectly fine. Yes, I'm just wondering, like, what can we do broadly with this term ambivalence, which certainly seems to be, which you've pointed out, is very much present in the work of Ashraf Ali, and certainly in my budding scholarship on Manazir Ehsan Gilani. I'm wondering what broader purpose can it serve? So I would really appreciate your insight on that.
Mhm. Well, I think one purpose that analytical attention to ambivalence does serve is that it allows us to pay attention to the local level, and it emphasizes the importance and the significance of looking at micropolitics, but also microsocial dimensions and the everyday, and reading our sources in such a way that we're really picking up on the small and the little compromises, because ambivalence is experienced there and then, right? In being torn between two things. So you have to know what are the two options, and this is where I think so many of these sources about and by South Asian ulama, but also other writers, are really can be read so productively, because they do really capture the the texture of everyday life, and you can see at different places in their everyday lives, individuals are struggling with different options. And then sometimes they go with an option that actually uh, complicates our understanding of their tradition. And I think that as scholars, we have to look at all of their choices and not stick. So if like reform or revival or religious authority, if these are the main analytical paradigms in which we study our sources, sometimes our sources can choose something that does not conform to an analytical paradigm and shows us their ambivalence about progress itself, or about the nation state itself, or about modernity itself, or even about Quran and Hadith and jurisprudence and scripture itself. And I think that one way we can within the scholarship attend to ambivalence is to really hear what representations of the everyday and the local are saying to us.
So I would like to ask Jude's other question, but there are so many other questions that came up, and as usual, you don't mind, I'll put your second question on hold, and note that Amina Khan, again, somebody I don't know, but she raised the interesting, it's more of a commentary, but it has a kind of question lodged in it that in places like Colonial Sind, it could be said that Sufi notions of love and desire were alive and well, but the types of literature translated and used as standardized Sindhi language are very telling. But it could also be argued the influence of Sufism in South Asia and South Asian Islam has always been and continues to be significant. And now there seems to be a revival of Sufism in the musical culture of Pakistan among the youth. So I guess the question she's asking is, apart from reviving, as you've so brilliantly done in this paper, the influence of a lesser known or virtually unknown and unexamined work on Hafiz by Ashraf Ali Tanwi, is there also something happening in music that has contributed to a revival of Sufism in Pakistan?
Absolutely, yes. And I think that that's one site of translation and appropriation that is very important, and definitely the different feelings and affective states that, for example, the music of the lyrics of Khwaja Amir Khusro, they evoke. They are, I would say, it's both continuity, an example of continuity, but also so much has changed and the medium is different, and people are putting these Coke Studio songs online. They're excerpting from them and sharing it on social media. And so there is also state-sponsored revival of Sufism. And this new book that's co-edited by Professor Catherine Ewing and I believe Rosemary Corbett. It's
Right.
really a wonderful book, right? I can't remember the title, but it's on
Sufism and
Sufism.
politics.
Yes, it's on Sufism and politics in modern South Asia and beyond, but it really has amazing essays. And I also believe a response by Dr. Lawrence that really shows the complex life of the Sufi tradition in its multiple scenes of social engagement and even online engagement in contemporary South Asia and the diaspora. So absolutely, in my other work, in my book, Muslims in South Asia, I do attend to some of those sources, the media, the social media sources that like Coke Studio that are translating um, Sufi classics such as the poetry of Amir Khusro in the South Asian context, which I believe was sung by Rahat Fateh Ali Khan and Abida Parveen. They came together to um, beautifully and masterfully render some love poetry that Amir Khusro wrote for his Sufi sheikh, his Sufi master, Hazrat Nizamuddin Awliya. So I think that there is both some sort of a continuity and a transformation, and it is also, I would say, a scene of survival.
So Ali Mia, it's 7:15. I don't think I'm going to get through all three of these questions, but let me try. The question that came from some Dadewala, some bearded guy whom I don't know from MIT named Westcote, is he thanks you for your talk, but then he wants to know in terms of the analogical interpretation in Tanvi, can you when you say he takes analogy for granted, Westcote wants to know, did he ever use the language of qiyas? And do you
Yes,
yourself, the broader communication of these interpretations that is traditionalist might also be advanced by explicit treatment of the formal logic of qiyas or analogy?
yes, he doesn't. In the broader paper that will appear in the Journal of Urdu Studies, I do discuss even the type of qiyas that he uses, right? So it's a specific modality of tashbih because he had studied formal logic in as a madrasa student at the Darul Uloom Deoband. So he does appeal to the formal formal technical categories of qiyas.
Well,
Um,
let's leave it at that because there are two other questions. One of which is I think is fairly easy. The other one of which could occupy us the rest of the night. But the one from a woman named Francesca Chubb Confer, she thanks you for your fascinating talk. And then she says the question is, did Ashraf Ali Tanvi himself write ghazals in Urdu or Persian? And since the form was so contested at the time as both representative of decline and decadence, but also a repository of Sufi tradition, did he himself write ghazals in Urdu or Persian?
he himself only wrote a short Masnavi, which is called Masnavi-e-Zerobam, but he did not really write ghazals. His biographer and his disciple Azizul Hasan Ghauri wrote many ghazals, and they would also read the ghazals of Hafiz and excerpts from the Masnavi of Maulana of Rumi in their daily sessions. So yes, he also in the biographical sources we find out that he had memorized 1,000 verses from the Persian lyrical tradition. So this was a person who knew by heart, at least according to the biographical sources, he knew by heart 1,000 Persian verses, and he would basically he would use these in different genres. And a part of what I mean by surviving genres is that the genres of Persian poetry, they survive in Muslim traditionalism as well.
Well, this is wonderful. And I promised Uruj Alam and also you that I would ask her first question last. So it's a question that you and I have talked about before, but she poses it in a very interesting way. How can we include South Asian and colonial Muslim women's voices, which display same-sex desire, in order to correct the polemical notion that women continue to remain on the margins of patriarchal institutions such as Madrasa mosques and in genres such as tafsir, hadith poetry, and even newspapers?
Yes. Well, I think here ethnography, Uruj, is very important. But in terms of the colonial period, one really has to read the sources against the grain and read multiple sources. And sometimes you hear voices that are recorded in androcentric texts, voices that have survived. So there are some fascinating, like one can read, for example, the novels of the Urdu canon to see how colloquial expressions, everyday expressions used by Muslim women, they are represented in the novel form. So one thing that methodologically one would really have to do is to look at the discursive tradition in a very capacious manner, so that works of theology, jurisprudence, tafsir, hadith are not the only sources for understanding the discursive tradition, but open up the discursive tradition to love poetry, but to novels and to collections of letters. And this is for the period that we cannot analyze directly, right? But in terms of today, doing research today, definitely a lot of cultural anthropologists are rightly correcting and ameliorating that. But sometimes you also have to recognize that in certain traditions do reinforce androcentrism, right, and patriarchy and patriarchal social institutions, and there it will be really hard to find representations of women or also voices of women themselves. And this is where we can turn to so many amazing methodological tools that feminist historiography has given us in terms of how to read the absence.
Well, I want to thank you, Alimi, on behalf of everybody who heard you and the people who asked questions and were able to get your very thoughtful and in some cases intuitive, in other cases expansive answer to what they were trying to find out. And all I can say is that we're looking forward to it. I hope you will share with us when this actually comes out in the Journal of Urdu Literature, so that we have a chance to read it. And I can tell you that having read it once, I would love to read it again and again. So thank you for that presentation and for this wonderful time together.
Thank you so much for everyone who was able to make it. I know there are like so many events today, so it really means the world to me. And thank you so much, Bruce, and also to Julie. I really want to thank everyone at DISC who made this possible. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.